nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram nama shrestam manumapi shachiputramatra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamarupurim maturim goshtavatim radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham prapto yasya pratita kripaya shri gurum tam natosmi vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindubhyaiva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah namo mahavaranyaya krishna prema pradayate krishnaya krishna chaitanya namne gaura tvishe namah jayatam surato pangor mama mandamater gati matsarvasva parambojo radha madana mohano kuladi devatamor madana mohan jar sevak raghunatha rup sanatam jaya rupa sanatana bhatta raghunath shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta dasa raghunath echai goshai kori charana vandan jahaite vignanasha bhishta puram adadana-strinam dantair yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhudisyam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Maha Sagar Svanamamrita Swabhavamrita Asadhan Kari Sri Gauranga Maha Prabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the chief swan in the nectared lake of Krishna Lila, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali, Sri Rupa Pad's compilation upon all things related to Krishna, Krishna-bhakti, Krishna prema, and so forth. So in our last class, we began to discuss verse 14, which is illustrating the great fortune of prema, or prema sobhagya, and doing so by stressing the durlabhatva, or the rarity, the preciousness, the difficulty to attainness of Krishna prema. So this verse says that the only price to pay, or the price that has to be paid in order to attain this Krishna prema, to attain this sthayi bhav that gives rise to the experience of kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, is laulyam, or hankering. And as we discussed in our last class, that the word Rupa Goswami uses in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which is synonymous with that, is lobha, in this context meaning not the vice we usually think of as greed, but you could also translate it as greed, but some sort of intense desire or intense longing for the Ragatmika-bhakti of Bhagavan's parikaras. So in our last reading, we discussed the definition of raga, the definition of Ragatmika-bhakti, as well as the definition of Raganuga-bhakti, as well as the eligibility for Raganuga-bhakti, namely lobha, or having this intense desirousness for a particular bhava that is found among the associates of Sri Bhagavan, and principally the associates of Sri Krishna in Braja. So where we left off in our last reading was with this statement of Rupa Goswami, where he gives the criterion by which it can be understood how or whether or to what extent, quote, lobha or lolya, intense desire or hankering, is present in the heart of a particular person. So he says that the mind will not require reasoning or injunctions to be motivated. So motivated for what means the mind will gravitate, the mind will seek that object, namely that desired bhava, not being motivated by a discipline or an injunction to do so, not being motivated by some reasoning about why it's good or why it's important. One will simply pursue it. One will simply find oneself pursuing it despite oneself. This is what it means to have intense desire, just as worldly desire or greed is said to corrupt the intellect, to make people do even what they know they shouldn't do. When Arjuna asks Krishna, why do people sin? He says it's because of kama, that kama covers over people's knowledge. They do things even, not that they're prompted to do things by their knowledge, but they do things even that they know is not good for them. They even cross against what they know better by the power of intense desire. So when intense desire is not of a vice, as it is in the context of the Gita, but when intense desire is for that supreme noble object of a particular form of Ragatmika-bhakti, when the mind is pursuing it, when that type of hankering is there for that object, then we can say that there is lobha, and thus there is eligibility on the part of the person to follow this path of Raganuga-bhakti. So today we'll go into further detail about the nature of this lobha, as well as other criterions for introspection and understanding its nature and its relative degree of presence or absence in one's heart and mind. So I'm going to pick up with some discussion from the Ragatmika-chandrika, which goes further into this subject. And again, I'm reading off the same PDF that we discussed last time. The whole commentary is in that PDF. So if you scroll down to where we left off last time, you'll see where I'm reading from now. So I have it here. Sri Chakravartipad also explains in this regard that the intense desire or lobha, may this be mine, in relation to this highly desirable object, arises of its own accord when the object is heard about or seen. This is comparable to the way the desire, let me have this, arises in the mind of a person given to a particular variety of sense enjoyment, such as eating sweets, when the person gets an excellent opportunity for such enjoyment, such as in the case of a person seeing a platter of excellent sweets being offered to them. So when there's something that you know and something that you like, no one needs to tell you to want it. When you see it, you automatically wish to have it or wish to partake of it. There's no explanation, no logic, no order required. Just as one does not need an order, just as one does not need to order such a person to eat the sweets or give them reasoned arguments as to why they should eat the sweets, because the desire to eat the sweets comes into the person's mind automatically when the sweets are seen. So, when intense desire for the bhava of a certain class of residents of Braja has arisen in a sadhaka's mind, there is no need for injunctions or reasoning to motivate the sadhaka to pursue the attainment of that bhava, or focus the mind on that object. The mind on its own, impelled by that intense desire, automatically flows towards and fixates on that object. Thus, neither injunctions nor reasoning, but intense desire alone is the fundamental motivation of a Raganuga-bhakti sadhaka, that is, the eligibility for the path. So, as Jiva Gosvami explained the nature of raga by reference to attachment to sense gratification, so also we can apply the same example to understand this idea of lobha. So just as we have experienced some intense desire for a particular type of experience, and how the mind will pursue that, fixate upon that even when one knows that it's detrimental to oneself. So also, when the mind is gravitating, is fixating on that spiritual object, on that desired bhava, then it can be said that the person really has some intense desire for that goal. So we may hear this and think, well, I don't have that level of desire, or, I'm interested in it intellectually, but that my mind actually gravitates to that naturally and intensely, the way I've experienced it gravitate towards varieties of sensory experience. Maybe hearing this, we may find some lack of that. But that's okay. Best to be clear with oneself about where one is and hear more about this topic, because it's not so simple as to say, oh, if I don't have a level of hankering that intense, then I have no adhikar, no eligibility, and therefore there's no point in talking about this. That's not the purport either. So let's go further into this matter. Sri Chakrabarti further explains in this regard that as intense desire, lobha, arises in the mind, there is also no consideration of whether oneself is worthy or unworthy of attaining the object. So just as someone hungry for power, like a politician, or in the older days, a member of the royal family seeking to become the king or seeking to become the prime minister, they're not really concerned with whether they're the best person for the job. They just want the job for themselves. They're not hung up on whether there's someone else more worthy than them or not. More likely, their greed is so intense that it blinds them from even considering the fact that others might be more qualified than they are. So similarly, in this regard, this object, when one intensely desires it, even the sense of one's unworthiness will not impede one's pursuit of it. Now that said, we find in the works of Rupa Gosvami and others many expressions of dainya, or a sense of weakness, or a sense of impoverishedness, or a lack of one's eligibility for this, and even expressions of self-reproach and for desiring something that one feels oneself to be so unfit for. So there is a place for some level of, or some waves, if you will, of feeling and reflection about one's unworthiness. But as we see throughout texts like the Udkalika Valari and the Karpanya Panjika Stotra, that the mind of the aspirant flows, or it oscillates. There's some expression of this desire, then there may be a wave of self-reproach, a feeling of unworthiness, but then again that desire will pull the person to, despite that, still pursue it further. So this dynamic is summarized in gist in a payar in the Charitamrita, referring to Rup Sanatan, where it says, Apana ayogyadaki manipai kob, tatapi tomar gune upajai lob, I think is how it goes, where it says, when my attention is directed towards my own unworthiness, I feel some agitation, or I feel some unrest within myself. But then again, when my attention is drawn to your qualities, your beauty, your charm, your sweetness, then again this desire again pulls my mind again to pursue that. So this statement of Chakrabarti Pad has its place, but we don't want to apply it too widely, or to say that there's no scope or no space for self-reflection or considerations of one's unworthiness. That won't be the intended sense, because we see that these great Vaishnavas, these great poets are indeed writing and expressing these sentiments. So what it means is that although there may be reflection and clear awareness of one's unworthiness, still ultimately one wants it, and one therefore desires the worthiness in order to be blessed to receive it. Something like this. So that's a topic which will come later here in the Padyavali. We'll get to verses that also discuss this exact topic a little further ahead. But here, where we're trying to stress the power of this intense desire, then the sense or the thrust of the citation in this context is that when this desire is strong, it will goad or it will egg one on, even despite their hesitations or their feelings of unworthiness that may arise from time to time. This is comparable to the manner in which a person intensely desirous of eating sweets immediately thinks of eating sweets when excellent sweets have been offered to them, without considering whether it would be healthy to eat them or not, whether they are made of certain ingredients or not, whether some should be saved for others or not, and so on. So, we see this sometimes among children when they're offered candy. They're not thinking, is there enough for my friends? They're not thinking, is this healthy or not? They're not thinking, was this made with, processed foods or GMOs or organic ingredients? They're not worried about any of this. They're just seeing the candy and they want to eat the candy. That type of unbridled desire, unhesitating desire. This is what's being alluded to. So the person simply thinks of eating the sweets at that time is not aware of anything else. The process of attaining a particular form of Ragatmika-bhakti, however, is nowhere nearly as easy as simply picking up a sweet off of a platter. A refined form of sadhana is required, and in regard not to the motivation for this sadhana, but to the manner in which this sadhana is to be performed, injunctions and reasoning are not only indispensable, but of crucial importance. So this is where Chakravarti Pad balances things out. He comes and he emphasizes and shows that the fundamental motivation is not an injunction, it's not reasoning, but the application of the motivation, which is raw desire, is very much refined and expressed through the mediation or under the influence of scriptural injunctions and reasoning given in the scripture. So this is where we don't want to, so to speak, swerve one way and then swerve back off the road too far the other way. If we say, it's all just desire, there's injunctions, reasoning, none of this scriptural stuff is necessary, then that will also be as big, if not bigger, of a deviation from the ideal path. So when Rupa Goswami is saying that the indication of lobe is the non-dependence upon shastra and yukti, then what he means is that the motivation is not coming specifically from them, but once the motivation is there, then when the person acts on the motivation, with what understanding, with what knowledge do they put that pursuit of the object into practice, that is very much focused upon and guided by how it is taught, how that process is taught in the Shastra. So Chakravarti Pad elaborates on that as follows. When a bhakta possessed of such intense desires inquiry into the means of attainment of that intensely desirable bhava inevitably arises, then a dependence upon injunctions and reasoning shall certainly occur. Because of demonstration of that is, of the means of attainment, occurring only by means of the injunctions of the Shastra and the reasoning taught in the Shastra, and not otherwise. So this is very strong language. The motivation is not the Shastra, but how to act on that motivation shall be guided by the Shastra and the Shastra alone. And to neglect to seek the guidance of the Shastra, the guidance of the acaryas in how to act on that motivation, there's no greater foolishness than that, actually, and there's no greater arrogance, and there's no greater, deviation than and misunderstanding of what it means to say that Raganuga-bhakti is not dependent on these things than this. So this is a very serious point, that how we shall act on that motivation, how we shall pursue that path, shall be meticulously refined, carefully understood, specifically from the words and the teachings of those people who have the very bhav we seek, those very nitya parikaras whose wealth we pray to be blessed with a drop of. And it is our faith that Sri Rupa Gosvami, Sri Sanatana Gosvami, Sri Raghunath Goswami, Sri Jiva Gosvami, they are those very nitya parikaras whose wealth we seek. So to rely upon, to live by their words, their carefully refined, extremely elegant and finely crafted poetry and prose, what more beautiful, what more safe, what more reliable, what more proof positive thing could there possibly be? And it is truly lamentable that even in the name of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, people don't study these works. People rely on so many derived works from them, written hundreds of years later in other languages, which provide, frankly speaking, only a vague impression of the clarity, of the lucidity, of the profundity, of the beauty of what those very nitya parikaras who are the carriers of the wealth that we seek have given. So it is truly the greatest blessing to have taste, to have ruchi, specifically for the works, for the words of Rupa Goswami himself, Sanatana Gosvami himself, Jiva Gosvami himself, Raghunath Das Goswami himself, and seeing a significant demarcation between that and everything else. This type of nishta, this type of fixity, specifically upon that very carrier of that very precise object, which is the heart's desire of the sadhaka, this type of nishta is extremely profound, extremely powerful, and can never go in vain. So our aim in such discussion, in absorbing ourselves in these commentaries of Jiva Goswami, upon the works of Rupa Goswami, these citations, these verses that were relished by Rupa Goswami himself, it is precisely to pursue this very process, this very practice, this very instruction of Vishwanath Chakravarti, that whatever degree of desire we have for that object, that when it comes to the means of attainment, then that shall be understood only by the Shastra and the reasoning taught in the Shastra and not otherwise. So, without excessive elaboration, I'll return to the passage. So he gives an analogy to illustrate this. Just as when intense desire arises for milk and so on, meaning dairy products of your particular fancy, then in regard to the inevitable inquiry into the means to attaining them, quote, how shall milk and so on become mine? I know it sounds a little funny to put it literally in English, but in other words, if someone wants to attain milk and they think, how do I get milk? Then what happens? Dependence upon a statement of instruction given by a trustworthy person knowledgeable regarding that shall occur. Therefore, furthermore, only from the statement of instruction from him, that trustworthy person, beginning with, you should buy a cow, shall one learn the process of fetching the cow, giving grass to her, milking her, and so on, specifically from him and not rather on one's own. So just as when there's something that you don't know, you need to learn it from someone who does, and by approaching that person, trusting that person, receiving an education from that person, one can learn the processes that lead to the attainment of the goal that you have. Just like that, one has to approach the Rup Sanatan, approach Jiva, approach Raghunath, reading these texts and study them with gurus, teachers who are steeped in them, and then hear and understand this process that they've explained about how it is pursued, how it is attained. And so that motivation will be raw, if you will. It will be purely a desire of the heart, not motivated only because some text said so, or some, it is said to be a great thing by so-and-so, but rather it will be something that is desired intensely from the heart. But then how one will go about fulfilling that desire, that will be very much guided by these texts. Just as someone who's really wants a bunch of money, what do? They think, I need a job. And okay, to get they say, I want to be such and such worker. I want to, be a programmer. Okay, so what do? They learn programming. And then once they learn programming, they do programming and they make money. So they're driven by a passion to make money. But to achieve their money, what do? They approach a teacher who teaches them the process by which they can earn the money. They learn the process from the teacher, follow the process, and then achieve money. So just like that, there's the goal, the motivation for the goal is raw, but the process of fulfilling or achieving the goal is very much regulated and guided by the teacher of the process. So this is the balance, so to speak, about the role of raw desire and the role of shastric guidance in the psyche of the sadhaka. So this is an important thing to understand. Moving on. Thus, although injunctions in reasoning are not the source of the fundamental motivation of a Raganuga sadhaka, they are nevertheless integral to learning and engaging in the process of Raganuga sadhana, and thus conviction and adeptness in them, in regard to them, are also part of the eligibility or adhikar of a Raganuga-bhakti sadhaka. So this is a point that is also sometimes discussed, that in the Sindhu, we find a discussion of the adhikar for Vaidhi Bhakti, and that is said to be Shraddha as well as Yukti. And a little bit further on, it's also stated that the level of Chitta Shuddhi, or purification of the psyche, these three things constitute the eligibility of a bhakta for Vaidhi Bhakti. Then in the separate prakaran later on Raganuga-bhakti, this is all in the second chapter of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, then the verses we've already discussed about lobha, or intense desire, are said to be the adhikar. So does that mean that desire alone is the eligibility, and having any shraddha in the shastra, having any knowledge of the reasoning given in the shastra, having any level of purification of the psyche, that's all just irrelevant to the process? That the adhikar for Raganuga-bhakti is something totally separate? No, because here Chakravarti Pad is saying that to follow the process of Raganuga-bhakti, one has to follow the injunctions and the reasoning given in the Shastra. So if one has no conviction in those injunctions, in that reasoning, one won't follow it. So the adhikar for Raganuga-bhakti includes the adhikar for Vaidhi Bhakti, or to be eligible for Raganuga-bhakti, one needs those elements and this intense desire, not it to the exception of that. This is the point to be understood. And Chakravarti Pad hammers this point at the end of the Ragatmika-bhakti in the following language, which doesn't come across quite as sharply in English as it does in Sanskrit, but nevertheless, the idea is there. He says, he stresses this point, quote, "Those who say that Raganuga-bhakti is absolutely always and absolutely in all respects exclusively beyond the injunctions of Shastra are deserving of censure, and have experienced in the past, are experiencing in the present, and will experience in the future repeated calamities." Enough excessive elaboration. In other words, what more can I say than this? That says it all. The people who are saying this, they're just deluded, and they're just constantly making trouble for themselves. Oh, this Raganuga path is difficult to see even for the devas. So this is how he ends his book, elucidating that very path. So what does this mean? It means even in his era, people were not getting this. Even in his era, there were people who were misunderstanding what Rupa Goswami wrote and how Jiva Goswami explained it. So these things have to be grasped very carefully, and as far as I can say, at least in my experience, unless you actually study these texts directly, you're very hard-pressed to get a clear understanding of them anywhere. So this process of studying the Purva Vibhag of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, these statements of derived on it, here in the Ragatmika-bhakti, which is essentially an extended commentary on that section of the Sindhu, the relevant passages in the Bhakti Sandarbha, some of which we're quoting. These things are the bedrock of the path. And as far as I am concerned, there's literally no other way one will ever achieve this goal if one doesn't learn these things carefully. Unless one is already learned them in a past life and is so advanced that they come naturally to a person. That's possible, but we can say exceedingly rare. Okay, moving on. Returning to the subject of the fundamental motivation of intense desire or hankering for the sweetness of a particular bhava of a Ragatmika-bhakti described by Sri Rupa Prabhupada in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.2.292 as the eligibility or adhikar for the path of Raganuga sadhana, it is also noteworthy that Sri Jiva Prabhupada speaks of this using the word taste or ruchi in his commentary on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.2.6. He also elaborates on this in his Bhakti Sandarbha 3.10. So this is important to note, and this is an interesting point, is that in the Bhakti Sandarbha, Jiva Gosvami elaborates on some of the content that's there in the Sindhu. And in some cases, he uses slightly different terminology. And anytime Jiva Gosvami refines his terminology, there's some significant import to that. There's some significant further light that comes from that. So what we want to attend to here is what Rupa Goswami called lobha. Jiva Gosvami is referring to the same thing using the word ruchi. And as I've mentioned here in the footnote, Rupa Goswami also uses the word ruchi as part of one of the stages in the self-manifestation of prema, which he describes at the end of the Purva Vibhag with this well-known progression: Shraddha, Sadhu Sangha, Bhajana Kriya, Anartha Nivritti, Nishta, Ruchi, Asakti, Bhava, Prema. So there, what is defined as ruchi, that is not directly equivalent to what Jiva Goswami is speaking of using the word ruchi here in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Same exact word, but being used in two different technical manners in two different texts. So that's to be borne in mind, and that will become clear when we see how Jiva Goswami discusses this. So he says, one in whom only taste, ruchi, for a specific raga, among the aforementioned ragas for Bhagavan, has appeared, and not rather a specific raga itself. So, in other words, not someone who's a Ragatmika-bhakti, not someone who has raga, but someone who has taste for some raga. In other words, some desire for, some interest in, some affinity for such a raga. In that one, meaning in that type of person, the crystalline jewel of whose heart is brightly shining with the reflection of the rays from the moon of that particular raga. So this is a beautiful illustration. Imagine the heart is like a crystal, and that crystal is shining and is carrying some color and some luster that's descending from a moon. And that moon is the light that's illuminating that crystal is a particular raga. In other words, is a particular bhava, a particular sthayi bhava for Bhagavan. So this sthayi bhava for Bhagavan that lives in the hearts of these Ragatmika bhaktas is shining like a moon. And these aspirants, these sadhakas, their hearts are like crystals which are shining brightly in this moonlight. So, in that type of person, what happens? Taste appears also for the manners of expression, or paripatis, of such Ragatmika-bhakti, that have been heard about in the Shastra and elsewhere. So, to continue the analogy, how is this light of this moon of this raga getting into the crystal of the heart? It's getting in there by hearing about that bhava, by hearing about the activities of those who have that bhava, by hearing about their seva to Radha and Krishna, by hearing about their activities, their mentality, their expressions, their gestures, etc., everything. Then that hearing is bringing that moonlight and filling up the heart, illuminating the heart. And where is that heard about? It's heard about in the Shastra, it's heard about from the mouth of the Guru, from the mouth of some sadhu. And plainly speaking, it's heard about from texts like the Padyavali, like Rupa Goswami's other writing, like the Bhagavatam, like the kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā, etc. So this person has this taste and is, in other words, is cherishing this moonlight that's illuminating the crystal of their heart. And not only do they have taste for that bhava itself, but then the way that that bhava is expressed. So the word paripati means, like, you could translate it as technique or finesse or fine expression, the artfulness, if you will, of how it's expressed. So they also appreciate that. In other words, how those Ragatmika-bhaktas, how they carry themselves, how they express themselves, the manner in which they intimately serve Radha and Krishna, those things also are relishable to that aspirant. So then, that Ragatmika Bhakta, of that one in particular, meaning of that person in whose heart taste for a specific raga and its manners of expression has appeared, proceeds following a raga related to him by means of taste. So what he wants to show here is, again, the motivation. When the person has this taste, then they hear, or they may be inspired to meditate, or to chant, or to worship, or to perform any action, and that's motivated by, it's an expression of that taste, that interest that they have in that raga and its expressions. So to illustrate this taste, that is, intense desire for Ragatmika-bhakti, Sri Jiva cites the following statement of Pingala, wherein she expresses desire for the raga of Lakshmi Devi. So this comes in the Bhagavatam in the 11th canto. So Pingala, she's having a reverie, or she's reflecting to herself one night. She thinks, he, meaning Bhagavan, is the friend, the most beloved, the Lord and the self of all embodied beings. I shall purchase him by means of my very self, and thereby enjoy with him like Rama, or Lakshmi. So Rama is the name of Lakshmi. So here, this shows that she's saying, I want to enjoy with him like Lakshmi. So what that means is that she has taste, or she has a desire for the category, the type of Ragatmika-bhakti that's found in Lakshmi Devi. So she's ready to offer herself to achieve, or to buy, to attain that bhava, and with that bhava to have that experience with Bhagavan. And Jiva Gosvami cites another statement of hers as follows: to illustrate the manner in which a sadhaka bhakta possessed of such intense desire shall practically engage in sadhana, Sri Jiva cites another statement of Pingala, quote, satisfied living in accord with attainment, that is, remaining satisfied regardless of whatever is encountered, and possessed of shraddha in this. So from context, that is, in the resolve that I shall attain Bhagavan as my husband, I shall enjoy solely with him, my beloved, by means of the self. So I've left this literally, the statement in the text itself, it says, I believe it's where is it? Atmana. Simply the word Atma in the instrumental case. So I will enjoy with him by means of the Atma, by means of Atma. So we know that the word Atma has many different meanings. It can mean the body, it can mean the mind, it can mean the self that leaves the body when the body dies. It can also mean the intellect. It can also mean resolution. It can mean many things. So in this context, what specifically is the meaning of the word self or Atma? This is where Jiva Gosvami comes and gives a very important comment. So he says, I shall enjoy with him, quote, by means of the self, signifies to be specific by means solely of the mind. Because of this path in which taste is predominant, that is, because of the path of Raganuga-bhakti, having a predominance of the mind, on account of generally only the mind being fit for such worship, in the case of one who has not become established in the form of one of his, that is Bhagavan's, beloveds. So, what he wants to say here is that her desire is to, or her taste is for serving Bhagavan as a wife serves a husband. But she's not Bhagavan's wife. She doesn't have the body and she doesn't have the situation in which she can literally do that. So how can she do that? She can do that in her mind, or in her mind she can accept that form with which she could do the type of seva that she aspires to do as per the bhava that she cherishes and seeks to attain in her heart. So, for this reason, he says that this sadhana process has a predominance of the mind, because it's only in the mind that one can, so to speak, quote-unquote, directly or practically engage in a manner of worship of Bhagavan that directly reflects the nature of the bhava that one aspires to. So I've also explained this in the text. Quote, here the point Sri Jiva is making is that since it is not possible for a jiva embodied in samsara to directly serve Bhagavan as one of his beloveds until the jiva attains a spiritual form that is suitable for such service, namely a feminine form with characteristics aptly suited to Sri Bhagavan's preferences. It is only possible for a jiva to offer service in accord with the bhava of a beloved of Bhagavan by adopting a mentally conceived form of one of Bhagavan's beloveds within the mind. Thus, a Raganuga sadhana bhakta, whose aim is the attainment of the bhava of a beloved of Bhagavan, shall mentally foster the sense of identity or abhiman of being a beloved of Bhagavan, and render service to him within the mind with a mentally conceived form of oneself as a beloved of Bhagavan in his eternal abode. Thus, the worship on the path of Raganuga sadhana bhakti is said here by Sri Jiva to have a predominance of the mind, as it is only there that one can don a form suited to serving Bhagavan in the manner that corresponds to the bhava for which one has taste, that is, intense desire or hankering. Sri Chakravarti Pad, hold on, before I get to that. So this is also something there's been historical differences about, and we hear about some, what can you say, a doctrinal dispute related to this that took place in the era of Vishwanath Chakravarti. Because there were some who, following Rupa Goswami's works, or, inspired by his works, we could say, and even by Jiva Goswami's works, tried to do this process with the body, or they decided, let's just dress our physical body in the manner of the body that suits the bhava that we aspire to. So this gave rise to these different sects. Some are called the Sakhi-Bekis, and persons who dress themselves literally and physically as gopis, be they, biological males or whatever. They took to physically donning the adornments of the category of form that is associated with the bhava that they aspire to. So this was not the intended sense of Jiva Goswami's teachings, of Rupa Goswami's teachings, and stalwarts like Vishwanath Chakravarti, they wrote to refute these ideas, and that created, a sectarian division, so to speak, among Vaishnavas inspired by Rupa Goswami's works in the 17th century in Vrindavan. And still to this day, there are different sects that engage in such practices, and I'm not here to bash anyone or claim some righteous sense of being superior to them. As in my personal humble understanding, I don't believe that was ever what Rupa and Sanatana intended. We don't find any evidence of the Goswamis ever engaging in such practices, or Mahaprabhu's Parshads engaging in such practices. I think there's one place where Haridasa Das says that he found evidence that there was some disciple of Advaitacharya who perhaps had done like this, but as we know, not all persons who adored Advaitacharya were necessarily in the fold, so to speak. So I'm of the conservative opinion, so to speak, that this was never intended by Mahaprabhu, never intended by the Goswamis, and is not something that's ideal to be done. But nevertheless, I'm also not inclined to engage in, self-righteous bashing of persons whose viewpoints are different than mine, or unnecessarily cause disrespect or hard feelings to anyone. But for anyone listening to this, I hope that it's clear from what I'm presenting and what I can gather from the works of the Goswamis that this statement here, by him saying that there's a predominance of the mind, indicates that there was never any intention for these things to be done at the bodily level, and rather it was designed to be a meditative practice only, and that there was a sharp distinction, if you will, between what was done with the sadhaka deha and what was done with the siddha deha, and elements of the siddha deha were not meant to be applied to the sadhaka deha. And this, we don't find any contradiction to that principle anywhere in the works of Rupa, Sanatana, Jiva, Kaviraj, Raghunath, Chakravarti Pad. This is all one united front, so to speak, on this topic. So anyway, I won't belabor that any longer. But there's one more point here that I'm going to come to from Chakravarti Pad's comment, which is also significant to show further the significance of what Jiva Goswami is saying here. So I quoted this definition previously, but there's another layer of meaning to it, which is now understood in light of this comment that Jiva Goswami just made. So I'm quoting it again. So the definition was, the complete meaning, that is, of Ragatmika-bhakti, the complete meaning is that attendant service, paricharya, in the form of stringing garlands and so forth, which is prompted by that thirst constituted of prema, that is an evident cause of natural absorption, one's desired object, namely Bhagavan, is called Ragatmika-bhakti. So why did Chakravarti Pad say that the whole meaning needs to be spelled out all the way like this? Then he adds in his commentary the following, quote, even in the case of the impossibility of following raga in the form of thirst, there is no harm. So again, as we discussed in the last class, the intrinsic characteristic of Ragatmika-bhakti was this ghada trishna, or this premamoy trishna, this intense desire. And the extrinsic characteristic was that the mind becomes naturally intensely absorbed. So he's saying that it's impossible to follow raga in the form of the intrinsic characteristic of thirst. But that's okay. Or in other words, there's no harm. Even though it's impossible, that's not a problem. So why is he saying this? So many of these comments are quite short or terse, and they reply to hypothetical prima facie views that they don't necessarily always spell out. So here I explain what is Chakravarti Pad referring to when he's making this statement. So the point he is making here is a resolution to an implied objection that the concept of Raganuga-bhakti is nonsensical. Why? Because, quote, following anuga, raga, is impossible for those who don't have it. So this is an argument that someone could raise. They could say, Raganuga-bhakti, bhakti that follows raga. So to follow raga, raga is a desire. So to follow would be to act upon a desire. So if I don't have the desire, how can I act upon it? I can't. You can't act upon a desire you don't have. So following or acting upon or adhering to this raga is not possible, because unless you have raga, you can't follow it. So what is this Raganuga-bhakti? This makes no sense. This is some confusion that someone could enter in this regard. So when the psyche of an embodied jiva in samsara is conditioned by a sense of identity related to the material body, filled with samskaras, vasanas, and desires for objects within samsara related to the body, the jiva's psyche has no thirst, that is intense desire for Bhagavan, based on the sense of identity of being one of his personal associates in his lila. So I'm just showing, this is two different worlds, Desires are all based on the samskaras and vasanas you have. The samskaras and vasanas you have are all tied to the abhiman, the sense of self that you have. If your sense of self is this body, how would you ever have samskaras and vasanas for an identity in a body that you don't even have? You won't. It just will never happen. So there's no way that from your conditioned experience you would acquire this type of raga or this type of desire for Bhagavan or for a particular type of service to Bhagavan. It just acquiring, conditioning towards something that's not even in the scope of your experience will just never happen. In such a condition, is it impossible for anyone to follow, that is, feel such thirst for Sri Bhagavan and act on the basis of this thirst, since one does not have any such thirst, that is raga, in the first place. It is in this sense that Sri Chakravarti Pad says, even in the case of the impossibility of following raga in the form of thirst, there is no harm. So in other words, he's conceding the point. It's true you can't follow that because you don't have it. So what does that imply? It means that the intended meaning of the word Raganuga was never exactly that. So what did it mean then? Because one who does not have raga can still follow the raga of a particular class of Ragatmika-bhaktas in a different sense. Which sense? In the sense explained by Sri Chakravarti Pad in his extended definition of Ragatmika-bhakti that we quoted above, meaning the sadhaka can still follow, that is, perform, the various types of attendant service the Ragatmika-bhaktas render to Sri Bhagavan, inspired by their raga for Sri Bhagavan, such as stringing garlands. So in other words, the way that associates of Krishna serve Krishna in Vrindavan, you can't follow that if you don't have the same mentality, the same desire for Krishna that they do. But you can follow that in the sense that you can still take up some activity even if you don't have that same intensity of love, that same intensity of desire for Bhagavan that they do. One can still adopt, so to speak, the general form or the general activity that is an expression of that bhava. It is for this reason that Radhakrishna Das Goswami explains the meaning of following mentioned in the aforesaid definition of Raganuga-bhakti in the following manner. So just to recap, the definition of Raganuga-bhakti was discussed in the last class and was defined as that type of bhakti which follows the Ragatmika-bhakti vividly manifest in the residents of Braja and others is called Raganuga-bhakti. So simply put, it simply says, Ragatmikam anusrita yasa Raganuga-jate, that which follows Ragatmika is called Raganuga. Okay? So if you can't follow it in the sense that you can't act on the desire that motivates it because you don't have that desire, then what was ever the intended sense that Rupa Goswami had for this idea of following it? So this comment of Radhakrishna Das Goswami is quite applicable, and this comes from the Sadhan-dipika, which is throughout the Sadhan-dipika, in 2 or 3 places, he gives a number of comments upon the Raganuga Prakaran of the Sindhu. So he says the following. Here, following, or anusrita, so he's commenting directly on this word from verse 268 in the 2nd chapter of the Sindhu, means adhering, anusaranam, that is, emulation, anukaranam, constituted of following the bhava and activities of the eternally accomplished people residing in Braja. Furthermore, it, meaning this, quote, following, means fixity in following a particular dear one of Sri Krishna, following them specifically. This is the established meaning. Furthermore, it, meaning this following, means becoming a follower of theirs and being a performer of bodily, verbal, and mental service akin to theirs. So when it says, that which follows Ragatmika is Raganuga, then he's saying it means following a particular Ragatmika bhakta, following the type of service that they do by also engaging in that form of service, by doing so with the understanding that one is assisting them, that one is under their direction, and thus emulating or acting in accord with the manner that they act, even though one doesn't have the same sentiment or the same motivation, the same exact psychological experience that they do. So you might say, well, why? Why copy them, or why this emulation? Because it is by adopting these forms that one can imbibe the bhava, that one can be blessed by them, that they will ultimately grant this. There's another comment in the Durgama Sangamani where it says that this bhakti, it ultimately uses the word nisyanta, it oozes or it flows out of the heart of these Ragatmika-bhaktas into the hearts of the Raganuga-sadhakas, when those Raganuga-sadhakas are following them, when they are dedicated to them, when they are showing the intensity of their desire for these things by adopting these activities and by putting them into practice. So ultimately, this is all a prayer for grace. This is all an appeal to be blessed. It's not that doing any of this translates to or causes the experience or creates the experience or determines that one will have the experience, but this is all what prepares the mind, prepares the self, and appeals to the heart of the bearers of that bhava, such that one shall be blessed with it. So this path of, quote, following the Ragatmikas is to do all of these things in that spirit. So that looks like we're about out of time. I'll just, one more sentence or two that's still on this topic, and then we'll conclude for today. So I have here, it should also be borne in mind that the performance described here of bodily, verbal, and mental service, akin to that of the Ragatmika-bhaktas, whose type of bhava is the object of a sadhaka's desire, is principally practiced within the mind of the sadhaka for the reasons explained above by Sri Jiva in the aforesaid passage from Bhakti Sandarbha 3.11. So again, the point I made that this idea of doing this, the type of service that these Ragatmikas do, that's only something that's possible in the mind because one doesn't have the body that would enable one to do it with the body in like manner. So that point I already explained, and it's just important to say that that same line of thought applies to what Radhakrishna Goswami is saying here. So just to wrap up the theme, it says, bearing this in mind, the principal point being made here is that one cannot follow, that is, act in accord with a thirst, meaning a desire, that one does not have. And thus the notion of following the Ragatmika-bhakti vividly manifest in the residents of Braja, described in verse 268, refers to acting in a manner akin to those who have raga, out of strong desire to attain that raga for oneself. In essence, to act out of desire for that desire by means of performing action akin to the action that is performed as a result of that desire. Meaning, to perform sadhana in the form of acts of worship that are akin to those performed as an expression of raga by Ragatmika-bhaktas whose raga one desires to attain. Because the fundamental aim of all such desire in practice is the satisfaction of Bhagavan, such emulation should not be dismissed as mere artificiality or deleterious imitation. Sri Jiva explains how profoundly pleasing it is to Sri Bhagavan as follows. So I'll just read this passage and then conclude for today. Attainment of being such, that is, of being a Ragatmika Bhakta, is heard of occurring just by means of emulation of those possessed of Ragatmika Bhakti, even when done out of ill intent, as in the case of Putana's emulation of a nursemaid. This is stated in the Bhagavatam, quote, even Putana along with her family was caused to attain you just because of her wearing fine dress. That is, just because of her having donned the garb of a cowherd woman that is very dear to Sri Krishna as a disguise in an attempt to murder him. So how much more so must the attainment of being a Ragatmika Bhakta occur as a result of continuous, genuine, or pleasing engagement in bhakti of such nature by those possessed of taste or ruchi for that. So in other words, rather than saying, oh, imitation, artificiality, this is nonsense, rather, no, this is something profoundly endearing to Bhagavan. What does he order lastly in the Gita? Man mana bhava mad bhakto. Be my bhakta and give your mind to me. So to give your mind to me by adopting and engaging in the mind in the manner of service and the spirit of service that is known to be the most profoundly dear to Bhagavan's heart by virtue of all the siddhānta taught in the Bhagavatam and the other Shastras. To engage in that as a gesture, as a way of saying that I aspire to be your bhakta, to engage my mind in service to you, to do something that is pleasing to you, all that I know to be the things most pleasing to do, I've taken it upon myself to do that and nothing but that. What is a greater gesture of endearment than this? So it is not that one is trying to fake something or that one is trying to deceive someone or make a show of anything. This is nothing to do with society at all. This is done entirely in the privacy of one's own mind and in the privacy of one's direct personal relationship with Bhagavan. And to adopt all these things that are known to be so profoundly endearing to him. He himself will also say that those who are not my bhaktas but who are bhaktas of my bhaktas are my greatest bhaktas. So to dedicate oneself in this manner as an assistant to his dearmost bhaktas, what could be more endearing to him than this? This is also a point made by Kṛṣṇa Gosvami in his, I believe it's in the Dashloki Bhashya, maybe not the Southern Deepika, that if Bhagavan says there's no one more dear to me than the bhakta of my bhakta, then he says, then those who are assistants of his dearest bhakta of all, Srimati Radharani, then they are supremely dear to Bhagavan. So those who would take up the path of offering themselves to Bhagavan and aspiring to serve Bhagavan with the bhava of an assistant of Radharani and engaging the mind in service in accord with such aspiration, what greater gesture, what greater manner of dedicating the self and praying for his grace and seeking to please him could there be? So in this spirit, the idea of Raganuga sadhana bhakti as following Ragatmika-bhakti is explained by Jiva Gosvami, by Radhakrishna Goswami, by Vishwanath Chakravarti, and so forth. So, I will conclude with that for today. Looks like our connection is a little unstable, unfortunately. So, I'll leave it at that. And we've got more left in this commentary, so it looks like this will go for another class, or maybe even 2 classes. Because in the next class, what we'll get into is further characteristics of this idea of lobha, or of this idea of eligibility for this process. So today we discussed more about the principal characteristic and also something about how that characteristic is acted upon, or something about the practical approach to this mode of sadhana. But as the verse under discussion is principally focused on how hankering alone is the price to attain this Ragatmika-bhakti, then the discussion will return to more about that hankering, more about that adhikar, and understanding how to introspect about one's own level or absence of that, as well as what is the process by which that can actually grow, or that can actually develop within one's heart and mind. So we'll return to that in the next discussion. So I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.